80 years ago today, Soviet soldiers captured a place where the Nazis murdered approximately 1 million Jewish men, women, and children, the Auschwitz concentration camp and killing center. Welcome. I'm historian Edna Friedberg, and today we mark that moment of liberation, which we now commemorate as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Auschwitz is much more than a symbol of evil. We need to remember that for some, it is a place of very personal, very painful memories of cruelty, violence, and profound loss. During our program today, 3 survivors of Auschwitz will share what they experienced when they were imprisoned there as teenagers in 1944. My colleague and friend, museum historian Lindsay MacNeill, is joining us today to share her insights. Welcome, Lindsay.
Hi, Edna. I'm honored to join you on this really important day.
I'm always glad when we can have a conversation. And Lindsay, let's kind of set the scene. What do we need to know about Auschwitz to better understand the experiences of the 3 Holocaust survivors we're going to hear from?
So, for Jews, Auschwitz was first and foremost a site of systematic mass murder. The Nazis actually first created Auschwitz as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners. Over time, they transformed Auschwitz into a massive camp complex, which included a killing center at Auschwitz-Birkenau that the Nazis used to murder Jews with poison gas in gas chambers. The Nazis and their helpers deported Jewish people from all over Europe to Auschwitz. And as you said, Edna, they murdered approximately 1 million Jewish men, women, and children there.
So I recently sat down with 3 Holocaust survivors who volunteer at our museum, and we sat together to talk, to look back on their experiences while they were imprisoned at Auschwitz. Irene Weiss, Stephen Fenves, and Ruth Cohen were only children. They were living under Hungarian rule when they were forced with their families onto freight trains. At the time, they had no idea where they were being sent. They had never heard of a place called Auschwitz. Let's listen to them now as older people, remembering looking back on their first frightened impressions upon arrival.
The doors opened and they started yelling, "Get out, get out."
There was the smell, this incredible, inhuman, otherworldly stench.
There was bedlam because they were immediately beginning to separate families.
2 SS officers were directing people right or left.
We children held each other's hands, we held our parents' hands. I mean, we're just literally torn apart. And in a matter of minutes.
I was separated from my mother. I remember my dad going up that way. I remember staying with my sister.
I had a younger sister holding her hand. A stick came down between us and she was sent off. I lost her. I lost my little sister somehow.
I mean, it's still really very palpable and vivid. You can hear the desperation and helplessness that they all felt, of course, on that train platform. A woman named Michelle has written in to say that her father spent 18 months imprisoned at Auschwitz, later was part of the death march, and that he told her he would never forget the smell, the same smell that Stephen is describing that comes from the crematoria, the place where they were burning victims of murder. Now, as terrible and chaotic as this arrival was, Irene, Stephen, Ruth, of course, would have had no way of knowing that their lives would be torn apart in an instant. We think of this as a place, as you said, predominantly of death. So it's extraordinary that each of these people survived. Why weren't they immediately killed like others?
So they were among the approximately 20% of Jews sent to Auschwitz who were not killed upon arrival, but instead were chosen for forced labor. Typically, what would happen when a transport train arrived at Auschwitz, the people on board would be separated into 2 groups, Jewish men and teenage boys in one line, and Jewish women and children in the other line, as you can see here. Then a Nazi SS officer would condemn most of the people who had gotten off that train to death, sending them directly to the gas chambers. But they would choose a smaller number of prisoners who seemed physically fit enough to perform forced labor. At the time that Ruth, Irene, and Stephen arrived in 1944, the Nazis considered anyone under the age of 14 to be too young to work. At the time, Stephen and Irene were 13 and Ruth was 14. But the Nazis weren't checking people's ages, so they were all considered to be old enough and physically fit enough to work. But this, of course, Edna, did not mean that they were safe, right? Auschwitz was a place of horrific violence. It was incredibly deadly. The Nazis could decide to murder someone because they were ill, because they became too weak to work, or for absolutely no reason at all.
So it's arbitrary,
Yeah.
really, who is spared and who is not. And let's also reinforce the fact that the Nazis were determined to murder every Jewish person at Auschwitz. They were simply giving a temporary reprieve to those they considered useful and that they could exploit for a while until they were no longer of use to them. I can't help but think when you're talking about two 13-year-olds, a 14-year-old, thinking about my own teenage sons, and to imagine what it would be like to be in this violent atmosphere at such a vulnerable age. But of course, the way that anyone would navigate it would also depend on if they had anyone close to them for comfort, for support. But Ruth and Irene, as we heard, were being ripped apart from their parents. And they were told soon after this arrival, they were told by Jewish forced laborers who had been at the camp for longer that the Nazis would have already, almost immediately, have murdered their relatives. Let's hear again from Ruth, recalling how she reacted to this shocking news.
Minutes after we got in, a young woman was running towards my sister. As it turned out, this young woman and my sister had been to a summer camp 5 years before that. She also told us right away, I want you to know that your mother and your siblings are already dead. And that was also a shock, but an unbelievable one. I remember rejecting it completely.
We have a comment from Mike who writes, it was beyond her imagination because what happened defies anything that people had previously encountered. It was a new level of evil, and that sort of cognitive dissonance that, how could this compute? You've heard other testimonies like this, right, Lindsay?
Yes, and I have to agree with Mike that it really makes sense that Ruth and others couldn't accept that their family had been killed, right? They had just been together. This had all happened really quickly, and as we heard, it was a very disorienting experience. Ruth personally describes that she was able to cope partially with the help of her older sister, Teresa, who you can see here, who was with her at Auschwitz. Somehow they actually managed to survive the horrors together.
And Irene also had her older sister, Serena, with her at Auschwitz. She was also lucky in that she was able to lean on two older female relatives for emotional support. Let's hear Irene talk about that connection and what it meant to her.
The day after we arrived, we ran into my mother's two young sisters who had come a couple of days before. They immediately arranged for my sister and me to be transferred into the barrack where they were, so I could lean on them. They were like parents to me, and I was so terrified 90% of the time that they saved me. I had these wonderful two aunts of mine that I adored as a child and looked up to, and so I definitely would not have survived without them, not even with my sister there.
So we can hear how these aunts offer some form of parenting in a way, some sort of maternal sheltering. And it's also a good reinforcement that it's not just about whether you have enough food or whether you're beaten or not, but of the importance of the emotional and mental kind of hugging that she was getting from these aunts. What about Stephen? Was he with any family members while he was imprisoned at Auschwitz?
So although Stephen did arrive at Auschwitz with his mother, his sister, and his grandmother, because he was a teenage boy, he was separated from them almost immediately. His father wasn't with them. His father had been taken away and actually sent to Auschwitz unbeknownst to his family 3 months earlier. Stephen never saw his father in the camp, and they only reunited after liberation. So Stephen was like many prisoners of Auschwitz. He was basically alone. He didn't have anyone to comfort him or support him, to give that adult guidance that Irene talked about receiving. And even though in Auschwitz, men and women were kept separate almost all of the time, Stephen did, however, manage to have an encounter with his sister Esty, which he recently described in this video clip.
Suddenly, my sister appeared. It was a terrible feeling. My sister, 2 years older than I, was very well known for her fantastic braids, colors, ties, etc. And there she was, on top of her head, maybe 2 centimeter high stubs. And that was such a depressing, such a disarming sight that I just lost it. I just couldn't handle it.
So we see in that photo, you know, those gorgeous braids, they were her trademark look. But that for people who were kept alive while imprisoned at Auschwitz, the Nazis did this consistently. And this was not a haircut. It wasn't like going to the barber shop. This was really shaving people in a brutal way, like you might shear an animal, not only their heads, but their bodies. Let's hear Irene and Stephen describing what else they were forced to endure, what was done to them shortly after their arrival at the camp.
We were not treated like human beings. We went to a place, had showers. It was a bathhouse, hundreds of women, undressed, the hair cut, body haircut. We came out looking identical. Sisters, mothers wouldn't identify each other. But the whole process was so humiliating and so out of this world.
You're thrown some ragged, used, filthy, striped uniforms. You are tossed some shoes with wooden soles. Whether they're broken or not, whether they fit your size or not, doesn't matter.
You know, it was subhuman kind of existence.
You can really hear how these degrading experiences are still seared into their memories. But I'm really struck that for Stephen, it was not only his own experience, but witnessing it in his sister, seeing that she had also been through this dehumanizing process. And of course, at Auschwitz, Jewish people who the Nazis didn't immediately kill were continually treated in a degrading way. They became basically nameless laborers.
And that namelessness, that sense of suddenly being treated as anonymous, degraded, a number tattooed on an arm, something that was only done at Auschwitz, not at other camps, is reflected in a comment that we have. Jack has written in to say, my mother, Auschwitz survivor number 52713, lived with it every day for the rest of her life. Thank you, Jack, for sharing that experience. And we're glad that this show resonates for you to see other families and other human beings who went on as your mother did. Because of course it was a daily struggle in this place to hold on to any sense of self. Having loved ones, friends, or family nearby was a sustaining force, but there were other things that many survivors attribute for their will to go on. Lindsay, could you give us a sense about how work that Stephen did in Auschwitz not only helped him to survive, but gave him some measure of purpose?
I get the sense that Stephen was a pretty extraordinary kid. He actually spoke 3 languages, and he ended up assigned as an interpreter for German company representatives who were coming to Auschwitz in search of unpaid labor. But it wasn't actually this official job that Stephen really credits. It was actually his unofficial work at Auschwitz that gave him the will to survive, to keep going. He ended up involved in the camp resistance movement, trading illegal goods, and passing and collecting information, basically for use inside the camp or even to try to get to the outside world. And these actions, these were very risky. They were actually punishable by death in the camp. And it was through these resistance activities, through this underground connection, that Stephen was able to help his sister. That time he described where he managed to see her, he noticed that she was freezing cold. She had only a striped uniform on, like many other prisoners, which was thin. It was nothing against this winter. And he managed through his connections to get her a sweater and a scarf for protection.
So just that tiny glimmer of empowerment to be able to help to protect his big sister, to keep her warm, which also could be life-saving. Let's listen to Stephen describe how being in this resistance, this forbidden movement, fueled him to go on day after day.
After I got accepted in the resistance, certain things didn't count anymore. Thinking about losing my parents, wondering whether my sister is still alive, the pain of everything that we witnessed, that didn't matter anymore. My assignment of getting a message across to one of the groups that worked outside of the safety perimeter of Birkenau, that was important, getting it through and not getting killed in the process. And that's what I thought of 24 hours a day. I suddenly acquired a will to live again and a will to resist.
It's so striking to hear how this forbidden work became his sole focus, that he was part of a group, that he had a mission. Stephen's job, though, as you mentioned, was as an interpreter, as a translator, and that was not as physically demanding as some of the other slave labor assignments at Auschwitz. Lindsay, tell us about some of the more physically grueling jobs, please.
So Auschwitz prisoners, basically regardless of their work assignment, worked long hours with barely any rest. They could be subjected basically at a whim to arbitrary and severe beatings. Some prisoners were used as forced labor for private companies like IG Farben and Siemens. So they were doing factory work, which could be very demanding. But many had even more physically grueling jobs, which we just saw a photo of a moment ago, working in construction or farming. And these are not only difficult physically, but they're also outside. So you're exposed to the weather, to the extreme heat or the freezing cold. And then some prisoners were even forced to serve the system of mass murder. Tragically, Irene's father was one of those prisoners who was assigned to a work crew whose job it was to remove corpses from the gas chambers and burn them in the specially built ovens or crematoria at Auschwitz. When he became too weak for this job, Irene later learned the SS shot and killed him.
And we know from the testimony of the few people who survived these kind of death processing brigades, both at Auschwitz and at other killing centers, that this fate was not unique, that the Nazis would often kill an imprisoned person either because they could no longer physically do the job, or in some other places because they thought they knew too much. So again, these assignments, horrific as they might be, were only a temporary reprieve from the death sentence that was true for all Jews there. I want to talk about some other kinds of jobs, though, because we know that Ruth and Irene also were offered jobs that offered a measure of protection. What kind of work did they each do?
So fortunately, neither Ruth nor Irene had one of these really hard, physically demanding jobs. Ruth ended up working as a courier, or basically a messenger girl, taking messages throughout the camp to camp officials. Irene was forced to organize mountains of belongings stolen from Jews. You can see this here. Basically, the Nazis took everything that Jewish prisoners brought with them when they arrived at the camp. So this could be food or clothing, valuables, but also eyeglasses, as you can see here, family photographs. And even though this wasn't physically demanding, I can only imagine that sorting through these objects must have been emotionally exhausting, because they really represented the people who had been killed, and not even necessarily just anonymous people. One day, Irene recalls how she found her mother's dress and shawl among the piles of belongings.
It's hard to know how to respond to that, and I have heard Irene describe it more than once, but the intimacy of holding a garment that you associate with your mom, and to know that the fact that it's there means that she is no more. There are no words for that. This idea about work as being protective is coming through and also resonating and reminding people watching with things they have heard. A woman named Betty writes, "I worked in a department store with a tailor who did sewing at the department store. He was a Holocaust survivor. His life was spared during the war because of his ability to do alterations on the uniforms of the Nazi officers. So again, if someone had a special skill, it might actually be life-saving. Now you're describing how Irene is sorting belongings that have been stolen from new arrivals, and that meant that she was in physical proximity, living and working very close to one of the gas chambers at Auschwitz. So week after week, she and the other girls and women doing this sorting job were also witnessing thousands of people in their last moments before they were killed. Let's hear Irene in her own voice describe what she saw.
We saw the huge numbers of people walking from the train past our barrack into the gas chamber. And often they talk to us. They call out, "Where are you from? And what's your name? And do you know so-and-so?" Minutes later, the chimneys were belching fire so hard that it was like a roaring sound. It was just unbelievable. It wasn't smoke, it was flames, like, like a wind. And we had just seen them, we had just talked to them. Little children carried by their mothers, pregnant women.
It's still very obvious that it is hard for Irene to talk about this and that she's grasping for words to describe this hellish nightmare of a scene. She's just a young teenager at the time and trying to understand that the mother or child that you had just been speaking with is already gone. It's too brutal, too jarring to accept. Lindsay, we have a question about how people got to this point, really, is what the question is. Henri writes in to ask, how extensive was local collaboration with the Nazis to identify Jews? So basically, how did they know who to round up and bring to murder?
That's a big question and a really important one, because the Nazis couldn't have done this alone. They relied on the help of millions of people all across Europe. We know that in some places it's local bureaucracies, local police forces that are helping the Nazis to round people up, to arrest them, to deport them to their deaths. We also know that sometimes it's individuals, it's neighbors, people who are giving away the location of Jewish people in hiding to the Nazis, who are telling them where they can find them. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of talking about how extensive collaboration was all across Europe.
Right, so it runs the gamut from very personal betrayals to betrayals by your society or your system. I know that Stephen, who we've been hearing from today, has talked about how during the process of being rounded up and deported from Hungary, that he never saw a German, that it was all done, in his case, by local Hungarian police.
That's right.
So Lindsay, how did this factory of death, because really it's industrialized mass murder happening at Auschwitz, what made it come to an end and when?
The Nazis had absolutely no intention of stopping the mass murder of Europe's Jews. It ended only because Germany lost the war. On January 27th, 1945, Soviet soldiers liberated the Auschwitz camp complex after having driven German forces out of the area. Most of the prisoners were no longer there. They had been transferred and transported on death marches, as one of our commenters mentioned earlier, to other camps. There are only a few thousand people still there. And shortly after liberation, a Soviet military film crew actually recorded what it was that they had found. And in this recording, which we're going to see here, you can see the immense scale of Auschwitz. Rows and rows of barracks. You can see the desperate state of the thousands of men and women who had been left alive in the camp complex, who were freezing, suffering from starvation and disease. The crew also showed children who had been imprisoned in the camp and the tattoos that had been imprinted on the arms of even these youngest survivors. Edna, you mentioned before that Auschwitz was actually the only camp where the Nazis did this. The Soviet film crew also entered some of the barracks to show the overcrowded spaces and living conditions that people had been forced to live in. You can see here the piles of belongings, things that have been stolen from people, and the mass burial of some of the victims, really, which just hinted at the scale of killing at Auschwitz.
And Jay has written in to say that I still remember the numbers tattooed on the arm of my grandmother's friend. Jay, I can relate to that. I remember playing Rummy Cube with my grandmother, with my babcia, and one of the women in the group also had this number that I didn't really ask about, but we knew that it meant something very, very painful and terrible. So thank you, Jay, for that. Lindsay, this Soviet film footage that you were just showing, eyewitness film footage, confirmed firsthand accounts which had circulated for years before the liberation about the huge numbers of Jews being murdered day and night at Auschwitz. It also provided undeniable evidence that could refute anyone who might attempt to deny and also to minimize the crimes that the Nazis and their collaborators had committed. So it is a really critical piece of evidence. Lindsay, we have another comment from someone watching. Timothy writes in to say, I can't even imagine the horror and fear felt by those who were sent to concentration camps, nor can I fathom the loss of humanity by the perpetrators of such inhumane crimes. And Timothy, half of what you say resonates with me, absolutely. Thank God we don't understand what they felt. But the longer I study this history, the more I am struck by the fact that the people who did this, who did these inhumane things, were in fact people, human beings, who also many times still had families who they loved, returned to normal jobs after the war. So actually what frightens me kind of the most is the mixture of this unimaginable evil in people who are relatable in other ways. So it's so complex and so painful.
And I have to agree with you that one of the things that's most difficult to understand is the role that these perpetrators played, that they are doing something so inhumane, so horrible and degrading, and then simultaneously living with their families or writing nice letters to their wives. It's really difficult to understand and process. And I also want to now flip our roles for a moment and ask you a question. I wonder if I'd like to hear a little bit about what it was like for you to listen to Ruth and Stephen and Irene be together as they reflected on their Auschwitz experiences.
It was very moving, and it was an immense privilege, but also distinct. I think that although over the course of many years as a Holocaust historian, I have interviewed hundreds of survivors, this was only the second time that I remember really speaking to people in a group. And there was a particularity that even though the three of them, Irene, Stephen, and Ruth, were all teenagers, all imprisoned in Auschwitz around the same time, they had such distinctive recollections, such distinctive experiences. They talked about, we took breaks during the filming of the interview, and they talked about how much they were learning from each other and how much it showed them that luck and circumstance had been a part of their survival stories. The memories they shared, the terror, the sense of separation, what gave them the will to survive, really helped to fill in the terrors of this place. At the time that we met, of the three of them, only Irene had ever returned to the site of the Auschwitz camp. For those who have visited, and some people are writing in to say that they have gone there, it's in southern Poland. The camp is a vivid reminder of what happened when hatred against Jews and against other groups escalated to become state policy. Irene has reflected that going back to this place felt like reliving every step of that horror. And for Irene in particular, she often talks about the separation from her youngest sister, Edith, the one who we see here in a white dress with the hair bow. Irene still talks about how she feels responsible somehow for not being able to stay with her sister. She wishes she could have done more to protect her. So it's a lot of feelings, and I just felt immense gratitude to them that they would talk about it. But it was hard. It was a hard couple of days.
Yeah, I mean, I can only, like, watching that clip of Irene, right? Like, that it's a different time. It's not 1944. It's not German occupied Poland. The Nazis aren't in charge, but that being back there was almost like bringing her back to that place. And I can only imagine. I can't imagine really how difficult that must have been. And I understand that although Stephen has gone back to some of the other sites where he was imprisoned, he doesn't ever plan to return to Auschwitz.
Yeah, that's correct, and a totally understandable decision. Um, you can understand why someone would want to go and why someone would feel they would never want to go. And actually, this week, for the first time, today, tomorrow, Ruth is actually returning to Auschwitz for the first time in 80 plus years. She's part of a delegation from our museum there to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the camp's liberation. Who can try to understand how difficult it will be to walk that ground again. I want to give a special shout out to a class of 8th graders from Miss Callicott's class in South Stanley Middle School in North Carolina. I understand that you are watching today. We are so glad that you're with us and that you are reading the Diary of Anne Frank as part of your curriculum. So we hope that hearing from 3 people around your age who had a really, really different experience from Anne Frank will help you to think about the enormity of this crime we call the Holocaust and learn more. So thank you, Ms. Callicott's class. Other comments. A woman named Lonnie wrote in to say, I can read, I can look at pictures, but in no way can I begin to fathom what these camps were like. And I know, Lindsay, you and I, in preparing for this program, kept saying, stop saying, I can't imagine, I can't imagine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it starts to sort of feel trite, but we really cannot.
No, that's right. I'm so struck by this class reading the Diary of Anne Frank and that they have joined today because Anne Frank was about, as you said, about the same age, and her diary ends kind of where the story we've told today begins, because Anne was eventually deported to Auschwitz, and we can only guess that she might have experienced some of the same emotions that Irene, Stephen, and Ruth described today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Lindsay. I think you've really enriched our understanding of what happened at this place that sometimes becomes a shorthand for evil, but in fact is a real place on earth where real people were taken and imprisoned. So we really appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks so much, Edna. It was an honor.
And on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we honor Irene, Stephen, and Ruth. We are grateful beyond words for their willingness to revisit their painful memories during the Holocaust to teach us about what happened. A woman named Lorraine has written in to say, so many young people, when polled today, think that the Holocaust was all exaggerated. And it breaks her heart that people in a multicultural world know so little about the facts that brought the world to this point. Thank you for that comment, Lorraine. My colleagues and I work every day to make sure that it's not forgotten, that people understand that this difficult and really in some ways incomprehensible history is in fact true. And that there are people with us still who can tell us about it from their own eyes, from their own hearts and minds. Every day at our museum, we remember the 6 million Jewish lives brutally extinguished by the Germans and their collaborators, and the countless other victims of Nazi persecution. They make real for us, they make personal for us the profound dangers of anti-Semitism, of hatred or demonization of Jewish people, and why it is so critical to call it out and combat it. It is especially vital to do so today when we see an upsurge, a more blatant expression of these attitudes, and then often even violence that stems from it. So thank you all for watching today. We invite you to share this program with your family and friends. Be well wherever you are. Bye-bye.